Okay. Hi, everybody. It's Holly Echo Hawk. Thanks so much for joining this call. The title of this presentation is Impact of Trauma on Tribal System of Care Transformation. And most of you know me, I think, but just to introduce myself, my training is in organizational behavior within the School of Psychology. I have been a director of licensed community mental health centers for children's services and adult services. I've been a behavioral health consultant on a national basis for quite a few years, and as part of that, I have written with Terry Cross and many of my other good buddies many documents on various best practices, and through that, I've had the real pleasure of being able to come to many of your communities to see firsthand the work you're doing. And the last thing I will mention is that I'm also an active part of an international indigenous behavioral health group. So I try to stay in touch with our indigenous colleagues in other countries, of course Australia, New Zealand, and our Canadian native neighbors. So Gary's going to, in the University of Maryland TA Network in Baltimore, he's going to advance the slides for me. So Gary, if you'll go to the next slide. This is just a reminder of your host, and then today's goals. So the way we're going to do this presentation is it's for 1 hour total. The first half hour is going to be my presentation on trauma and the impact on system of care, potential impact. And then the second half is actually for you, to hear from you all on what your experiences in how trauma has affected developing systems of care on multiple levels. So we're going to move through this and see if we can get through this as quickly as possible, my part, so we can get to your part, which is the most important. And you'll see that point number 3 on the slide is that when we get to the group discussion, those are the different levels that we want to have some conversation about. The individual, family, community level, the impact of trauma on that level, the impact of trauma as you see it on tribal policy and decision making, the impact of trauma on the service system level, and the impact of trauma on broader service system change with your other partners. It could be your county partners or your state service partners. So if you can go to the next slide, Gary. You know, the most important thing about any discussion about trauma is safety and comfort. I remember the former graduated system of care group from Oglala, and our friend Ethelene Ironcloud Two Dogs often talked about safety and comfort with trauma. And she would often say that with the children and families that they served, the very first thing that they did as part of their treatment approach was comfort. So tending to the physical safety and the emotional and spiritual safety of people who have experienced trauma is really important, and that includes you all as well. So I just wanted to recognize that safety, organizational safety, cultural safety, physical, emotional, spiritual safety is really important. So this discussion today, I hope you will feel comfortable and safe and willing to have a frank discussion of how, in your opinion, you have seen trauma impact your system of care implementation, and beyond just the impact, but how do we move beyond that? How have we moved beyond trauma and system of care implementation? So I wanted to say something on the next slide, Gary. So next slide. Okay, primary trauma defined. You have a great resource in your NICWA technical assistance folks, and you all might remember that they have put together a trauma-informed care fact sheet a few years back, which you can still access if you don't have it. And there, in that short fact sheet, it talks about trauma, and it defines trauma as an event or series of events that causes moderate to severe stress reactions. Traumatic events are characterized by a sense of horror, helplessness, serious injury, or the threat of serious injury or death, affecting those who suffer injuries or loss. You know, there's another part of trauma, though, that I want to make sure that we touch base on, and that is the biology of trauma. Trauma as a reaction to acute stress. Trauma, because we often talk about what occurred that created the trauma, we don't spend as much time talking about the physical reaction to trauma. So I just wanted to touch on that for just a second. So trauma is an instinctual process that has not been allowed to come to completion. So if you think about what happens when you or someone you know experiences trauma, something happens, right? Trauma occurs. There's some, whatever the traumatic event is. There's shock, there's pain. Something happens. Something alarming happens. So what happens in your body is your body obviously reacts and becomes aware that something happened, that some kind of, you're in shock, you're in pain, and your body will acknowledge that onslaught of trauma. And the way your body acknowledges it, regardless of what age you are or how young you are or how verbal you are, your body will physically respond to trauma. Your heart rate will go up. Your body will release adrenaline. Your brain goes on kind of high alert. You know, you get to that point of fight or flight. So what happens when you're exposed to trauma is your body will react. You have a physical reaction. A child will have a physical reaction. A grandma or grandpa will have a physical reaction. Everyone will. And then that physical reaction will rise, and then it'll fade. And that process of the physical reaction in a normal circumstance is about 90 seconds. What happens in trauma that we're talking about in our communities is the stressful events aren't just something that caught somebody off guard and shocked them temporarily. They're the result of extraordinary stressful events that shatter sense of security. Doesn't always have to cause physical harm, but just the threat of harm. And of course, it can be a one-time event. Many things can happen over a period of time. There's often some overlooked causes to trauma. We see this in our young people that you all serve: relationship breakups, humiliation, having a deeply disappointing experience. So there's many ways that trauma can occur, but the kind of trauma that we're talking about has moved beyond just the 90-second biology of rising and fading physical reaction. It is deep trauma, and many of that can be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress. So next slide, please. Secondary trauma, and I know you all are very familiar with, and there's growing consciousness of secondary trauma. Secondary trauma is experienced by someone who's indirectly exposed to trauma. Are people, your staff and yourself, working with families in communities that have been in trauma and sometimes long-term trauma? There's a risk of secondary trauma exposure just by hearing the trauma narrative over and over, hearing the story of what happened to the people you're serving. Sometimes they refer to secondary trauma as vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout. I know many people who actually don't like the term compassion fatigue because they say they choose to do the work that they're doing. their well is filled by helping families. So it's not compassion fatigue. They don't particularly like that term, although it's it's a pretty common term. So secondary trauma, really important. Growing awareness to it. An important part of resource for secondary trauma is clinical supervision and coaching. One of the ways to allay secondary trauma is for the supervisors and clinical supervisors to have specific training in how to be a coach to your staff who are exposed to trauma. And I'm going to give you some resources for that as we get closer to the end of the discussion. So if you go to the next slide, please. So common responses to secondary trauma, of course, are hypervigilance, hopelessness, guilt. But other symptoms that impact our system of care development and the hard work that you all are doing trying to grow your system of care is anger, or people being cynical, becoming insensitive to violence because sometimes your care providers are seeing so much of it, minimizing violence, becoming more challenged in being able to really embrace complexity because the overwhelmed state that we might be in about seeing families in trauma.
Holly? Okay, it seems that Holly's line just dropped. She'll be dialing in momentarily, and we'll get started. We'll pick up right where she left off. One moment, please.
Hi, it's Holly again. Here I am. So just to continue the list of ways that we see secondary trauma play out within our organizations is loss of creativity, poor boundaries. So secondary trauma has potentially has a huge impact on our systems of care. So next slide. I wanted to just mention the founder of Internalized Oppression, a Brazilian educator and philosopher, and his name is Paulo Freire. And he, of course, he died in 1997, so it was quite a long time ago. But he was the author of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and that was some of the foundational work that Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart used as she developed her historical trauma work. His work is full of quotes and information and thinking about oppression and internalized oppression. One of his quotes was, "The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom." His work, even though it's quite dated now, is lasting work, and our experience with internalized lateral oppression, lateral violence in our community, sometimes much as we don't want to see it, we see people hurting other community members and being aggressive to each other, sometimes because of families, history, sometimes because of politics. But all of that is other lateral oppression impacts our ability to move our system of care development forward in a smooth way. Not always, but sometimes. So next slide, please. So the historical and ongoing trauma, of course, is our good friend Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, and I know she's been able to come to some of your communities, and she's also presented at some of the tribal system of care grantee meetings. Her work, of course, is historic in its own way of talking about unresolved grief. And the other point that I wanted to bring up in her work is that we sometimes forget is that parents can inadvertently pass on their trauma response patterns to their children. But each tribal community, of course, and you all are living examples of how your community deals with their own strengths and their own history and their own ways to deal with trauma. So we can go to the next slide. We also see trauma impacting families. Family members may have their own individual trauma experiences. The family relationship may have challenges. Family functioning will have challenges sometimes because of trauma, the experiences of the parents or the grandparents or the young students in school. Trauma impacts families' communications ability as well as culture. And then there's intergenerational challenges. So I just want you to think about the different levels of way trauma impacts families that you work with. So next slide. Trauma also impacts our ability to plan. Our tribal community's ability to plan and make decisions and manage the complex change that the system of care work is all about can really be affected by trauma. And we have to remember that the people that we have to lead our tribal leadership and our tribal elected officials, of course, are all tribal family members. And sometimes they have their own experiences of trauma. They're concerned about the trauma they see in their community. But trauma impacts planning and decision-making. And trauma can either be a positive influence or a negative influence on tribal decision-making. It could be a negative influence if unresolved trauma is impeding communication and planning and ability to move forward with complex change. It can be a positive influence if elected officials really recognize, and many of them do, they're concerned about trauma in their community, and they are moving forward to try to make something different happen, to make something positive come out of it, and using their system of care resources as the mechanism to make that happen. So the next slide. So this is just a little slide about cogs in a machine. So at the bottom right, historical and ongoing trauma in our communities impacts families and sometimes can create challenges within our family functioning. Family functioning impacts our tribal leadership, planning, and decision-making because we're all part of families. So there's a real link between how well our wheels all turn and connect related to trauma. So the next slide. So here's good news. The good news, really great news, is that trauma and trauma-informed care has moved from the position of what's wrong with you, which is the old school way, to what's happened to you. Trauma-informed care as a national, and actually not national, but international movement is really exciting. Many tribal organizations are working hard to figure out how to transition to a trauma-informed care organization in all of their operations and in their practice with families. Much growing attention to secondary trauma and not just secondary trauma as an individual person, but secondary trauma as an organization. There are organizational assessment tools to help leadership determine gaps in their organizational response to secondary trauma, and I'm going to give you some of those resources at the end. And the other good news is there's continues to be so much strength in cultural healing and in our ability to go back to our cultural roots to rebalance and reset our spiritual status, the biology that I talked about before, training ourselves to not be more in control of the reactions that we have to trauma exposure. So there's a lot of great things that are happening in the field of trauma, and you all are part of that. So the next slide, I want to share with you one of the topics that NIPWA has been supportive of is a whole series of what we call native TED Light Talks. And if any of you have watched TED Talks on National Public Radio or online, there are exciting videos of someone who has a good idea that they want to spread. So we started developing these mini native TED-like talks, and I want to show you one of them now, and Gary's going to start.
Dr. Brenda Restool, Wapsquest Dijnakas, Megisi Dodem, Dokis Dinjaba. I'm Anishinaabe Kwe from Ojibwe in Dokis First Nation, and I am the chair of the First Peoples Wellness Circle. When I started talking to clinicians and they started talking about things like mindfulness and even things like eye movement desensitization, I realized that a lot of those practices already happen in our communities. And I was really fortunate to spend some time with elders in a prison system as well as in a community system and learn that our practices, whether that's things like smudging, doing cedar baths, going to sweat lodge, that they all play a critical role in helping people to get re-grounded and reconnected, and sometimes even learning about who they are, because they may not know that at all. And I think about my time in working at Prison for Women, that a lot of these women, it was the first time they really learned about who they were and developed a sense of pride in who they were. So as I start learning about things around trauma-informed care and people start talking about mindfulness, I think, well, that's what we already do. We already go out and we might go on the land and pick berries or go sit by the water and pray, or we might sit at a fire and look at the fire, and that's all mindfulness type of work. It doesn't have to be so wrapped up in fancy phrases. It's things that connect us back to land and connect us back to people. And then when they start talking about things like doing experiential work, whether that's eye movement desensitization or doing anything that is more thought-based work, I think about the sweat lodge and I think about cedar baths, and I start realizing that that work is that same type of experiential work where you don't necessarily have to be teaching or talking to people about their trauma and the experience and how to move beyond it, because as soon as you get into sweat, you're able to give that away. As soon as you go into a cedar bath, as you're learning about yourself and finding that vortex of trauma, as they call it sometimes in trauma-informed care, that our elders and our helpers, they find that, they see that it's held sometimes in your chest or in your back, and they move it out, and you get it out in some way through tears, through purging. You purge it out. You have that discharge, and I think it's how phenomenal that we've been doing.
Thank you, Gary. So I hope you all enjoyed that example of Dr. Brenda Restool, and she is really a fabulous person, and as you heard her speak, she has a lot of experience working in women prison systems in Canada. And I thought she really did a great job of linking up what we were talking about in terms of exposure to trauma to the physical holding of trauma, and how our rich tribal cultures have many ways to help release that trauma. So that's a lot of food for thought for you all. I wanted to move in now, and we are almost exactly on time, into the group discussion. Oh, before we do that, I'm sorry, there is one more slide. Resolve trauma. So this is the good news. You know, the other graphic that I showed you with the red cogs was what happens from a more of a negative perspective. This is what happens in a good perspective. These are the same types of interaction and wheels that have to turn in our tribal communities to implement our systems of care, to grow our systems of care. And this is what can happen if we resolve the trauma in our communities. So many communities, starting at the bottom right, go through some kind of community healing process. I remember one of the early tribal systems of care, Sault Ste. Marie band of Chippewa Indians, their tribal leadership developed a tribal resolution. It was very simple. It was one page. And basically in their resolution they said, we are no longer going to be victims of our trauma, and we're not going to let trauma impact us anymore, and we're going to start a community healing process. So they did, over a couple of years' time, to really openly talk about their trauma experiences as a community, and went through a whole community healing process. Many other groups are doing that, especially our Canadian Native relatives are doing that through truth and reconciliation efforts. South Africa, to think about the South African people, also went through a truth and reconciliation process. So there's different ways to do community healing. But if that happens, the result of that positively is stronger family functioning. And the impact of that, the next cog, is tribal planning is in sync, meaning that the system of care works. For this example, is all the planning is working together. People are making clear-minded decisions. People are able to deal with the complex changes that are needed. So when trauma is resolved in community, and maybe it will never be resolved 100%, but instead of having 100% oppressed trauma, to get it out in the open and have some facilitated process to talk about it and move through it, can really impact on multiple levels. So next slide, please. So what we wanted to do now is to open it up for group discussion. And I sent out an email last week. I'm sorry it didn't get out. It was returned for some people, so not everyone received it, but I tried to give you a little heads up that we are going to have this discussion. So what we wanted to do is to have you all contribute and think of share any positive solutions you have seen in your community of addressing trauma and lessening the impact of trauma on the individual, family, community level, on the tribal policy decision-making level, with your tribal service system level, working between your tribal programs, and even in your broader system change level with your non-tribal and tribal partnerships. So if anyone has anything they'd like to contribute, I'm sure the NICL folks will be taking active notes, and we will get these notes back to you of suggestions that you all bring up in these various categories. So who would like to start? Of something they'd like to share that they've done or have seen done in their tribal community to solve or address lessen the impact of trauma. see that Lucinda in Nebraska is typing something. I can tell you that, while we're waiting, I can tell you that at the tribal policy decision-making level, one example is the Sault Ste. Marie group that their tribal elected officials developed the policy statement on taking action as tribal leadership to address the trauma in their community. So that tribal resolution is one example. And on the tribal service system level, I can think of another example of establishing tribal provider networks. And Pasquayaki did a wonderful job. And again, it started with their tribal leadership mandating through tribal law that a Pasquayaki provider network be developed, and it required that all of their system providers, from behavioral health to housing, I think, pretty broad range, which is wonderful, were all required to meet. The leadership of those systems were required to meet monthly to coordinate their decision making and move all of that forward. Lucinda from Nebraska submitted a written comment about the system of care was able to have the community come together to agree to have a sweat lodge available as a resource for community members. And that is one way that they dealt with having a resource to address any duress or stress that community are feeling. Any other contributions? You know, another thing, too, that we will try to do is, and I can work with the Nicholas staff on doing this, if we can also take these 4 levels and based on our collective experience of working in different communities, we can make lists of suggestions under each of these areas of positive solutions that we've seen in the broader system care area. And I think there's a couple of other people that are typing responses. You know, there's some core tips about trauma recovery that are very important for individuals and families. And there's just 4, and they're very basic. One is moving, get moving. Having families that have been exposed, or children or young people who've been exposed to trauma, to start walking and exercise and, you know, physically moving. A second of the 4 tips is don't be isolated. Doesn't mean you have to talk about the trauma that happened to you, but stay social, seek support. The third trauma recovery tip is self-regulating. You know, the biology part I was talking about before. Self-regulate your nervous system, calming yourself, breathing, staying grounded. And for some tribal young people, that means paying attention to the water or the trees or holding a rock, literally. Whatever makes sense in your community. And the fourth one is taking care of your physical health, making sure people sleep, that they're eating well, doing what they can to reduce stress, going to safe places, avoiding alcohol and drugs. So there's some basic things about trauma recovery that is important. And food, physical health, and exercise are two key parts of it. So a couple of other suggestions that has been typed in is I'm reading it. That Rocky Boy has been difficult to maintain focus and drive to where the support and drive when the support is limited. The National Council for Behavioral Health and the trauma-sensitive school learning community also has some potential for replicating across Montana tribal communities. Thank you, Curtis. And Jamie Bark is simple, but having a clear vision and mission that you go back to when you hear or see something that is lateral oppression. And the gentle reminder of why we are all together and focusing on solutions seems to help. I think I agree with that, Jamie. True. Any other suggestions? I do think, too, that one of the things that I've seen in tribal communities that are a little stuck in lateral oppression without realizing that's what's happening, or stuck in active trauma because of a series of what seems to be endless funerals. Sometimes in some of those communities it's helpful for someone from the outside to come in and share with tribal leadership examples of how other tribal communities have moved beyond. Sometimes people within a community, it's too difficult. There's too many links. So it's sometimes helpful to have someone, an external person, come in, or one of your peer tribal systems of care maybe, or so something to kind of break it loose from the stuck state that it might be in. Well, I'm not seeing any other contributions, so I think we should just go ahead and move on to the next slide, Gary. So these are some resources that I wanted to talk to you about. And we're lucky that we have a growing number of wonderful resources and references for our work in the trauma field. And of course, the Bigfoot Fort at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center is really important and very tribal specific. And some of your systems of care have may have gone through the training that they offer and sent a team of people to work with the Indian Country Child Trauma Center in Oklahoma. And I wanted to make sure you had Eve's email address so you can send her a query about if you're not that familiar with the work that they're doing. Of course, I already mentioned the Nicholas Trauma Informed Care fact sheet that they put together, and if you don't have a copy of that, you can get in touch with your TA folks, and they will, the NICWA TA people, and they'll be happy to give that to you, probably also on their website. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is always a resource of general traumatic stress information and some tribal information, but they're an active resource. The last two I wanted to mention here is the Secondary Traumatic Stress Organizational Assessment Tool that I mentioned, and that is out of the University of Kentucky, and Dr. Jenny Sprang is heading that. It's it's not tribal specific, but it is an organizational assessment, but it's sometimes helpful to look at it to see if it covers all the different areas of change that needs to happen in organizations to become a secondary trauma and secondary traumatic stress informed organization. So that is a way of looking at kind of having a roadmap to look at your organization, which is a fairly, it's not an investment necessarily in dollars. It's an investment in time and thinking. But it's really important, especially for tribal communities. And they have had some tribal response. They haven't really actively connected with tribal communities for their assessment tool, but they do have tribal respondents to it. And I just thought, my training's in organizational behavior, so I'm always looking for tools that can help transform organizations. And so this is a good tool. You might want to take a look at that. And if you get in touch with Dr. Jenny Spring, I'm sure they would be. I think you can access it online. You don't even necessarily have to take the be part of the study. You can just look at the tool itself. And then the last reference I wanted to give you is Dr. Brian Miller. And Dr. Miller is out of Salt Lake City. He is the director of children's behavioral health at a children's hospital or an inpatient clinic. And he has a model for trauma-informed supervision. And he is a very incredible presenter. He's really funny. So I always thought he's a great fit. He's not a tribal person, but he's got this sense of humor that is makes talking about trauma and secondary trauma and, well, I won't say it's funny, but he has a way of, he would be a good connection with tribal communities. Let me just put it that way. But his trauma-informed supervision training is really some of the best I've ever seen, because he's teaching supervisors to be aware of the secondary trauma exposure of their staff and how you can provide supervision and coaching consistently in a way that addresses trauma. So it's a different way of active thinking about how you supervise and how you coach. And one of the areas that I wish was we had more resources for in Indian country is that whole clinical supervision level and vision. Many times our supervisors are very busy working on grant proposals and doing other administrative tasks and are not able to spend as much time as they would like to on actually coaching and providing support to their own employees. But Dr. Miller does as a great model of trauma-informed supervision. And I believe he also, if it was not Dr. Miller, it was a colleague of his that talked about how they do debriefing with staff that have been exposed to trauma or have heard of a particularly horrendous trauma narrative. And one of the ways that they did that is, they had a name for it too, I think they called them hot walks. So what they did is they combined clinical supervision skills with the physical awareness of the physical changes that happen to someone exposed to trauma, that being their staff person. And they always did their debriefing trauma narrative by walking. It literally would take their staff person for a walk, and they would give them a bottle of water to replenish the liquid in the staff person's body, and then they did what they called these hot walks, where they would debrief as they walked. So they were trying to consciously not only debrief the trauma situation, but they were paying attention to the physical biology part of what happens when you get exposed to trauma. So that's the kind of work that Dr. Miller does. Now I know some of our tribal colleagues, and well, I'm blanking on my buddy's name, but there is an effort now to develop a tribal version of secondary organizational trauma. And so we'll keep you posted on all of that. So I think the last slide is just my contact information. And if anyone has anything else they'd like to contribute, you have time to do that now, or we will go ahead and close we'll wait a minute or so, see if anyone else has any final comments, and if not, we'll go ahead and close this session out. So not hearing anything or seeing anything typed, I'm going to thank you all for your attention and know that this is, are you seeing any comments?
Yeah, Trish Carlson asked, are there organizations that have adapted trauma-informed care models? If so, which ones have they used?
I'm sure there are many organizations that have adapted trauma-informed care models. And I think you're talking about, I don't know, Trish, if you're talking about a clinical treatment model or an organizational model. But this is kind of an odd coincidence, but when I was communicating with Dr. Miller to make sure I had his contact information correct, he's actually going to be here in San Diego this week, which is where I live. So we're having dinner on Thursday, and she's talking about organizational. And I will talk to him about that. That's part of what I wanted to talk to him about. So I will get back to you, or have Nick will get back to you on your question, Trish, and for everyone else. I'll do a little summary report of my conversation with Dr. Miller. And he and Jenny Sprang are very closely connected. He was a co-author of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Organizational Assessment Tool that I spoke of. So I will get back to you, or have Nick will get back to you on your question about which trauma-informed care models from an organizational perspective have been used. Well, I think we are ready we're going to close out just a little bit early, but I know everyone has busy days. So thank you all again so much, and I will see you in the near future.